More than 500 years ago, the American continent was still a barren land. The native Indians lived on this land, lived a quiet, peaceful, and uncontested life. But they never imagined that, in the future, the land where they had lived for generations would become their nightmare. They would never have imagined. In the next few hundred years, this land, an incredibly powerful empire, would be born. In the early 15th century, with the development of the European commodity economy and the emergence of capitalism, European countries' domestic trade could no longer satisfy the expansion of capitalism. But at that time, the Ottoman Empire controlled the land Silk Road, and ancient Chinese shipbuilding and compass technology were introduced to Europe one after another. So, European countries began to seek the maritime Silk Road to open up the sea trade routes between East and West. The age of navigation began. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, with the support of the Spanish royal family, began to sail to the kingdoms of India and China across the ocean. However, Columbus' voyage did not directly reach the eastern countries, but by accident discovered the American continent. And Columbus' discovery made a sensation in Spain and throughout Europe. Western European countries immediately invaded and expanded in America. Spain quickly became the first colonial empire. However, the American Indians began to fall into the abyss of colonial suffering and the blood of massacre. After Columbus discovered America, he established a colonial and enslavement system in Latin America, which brought serious disasters to the Indians. The conquest and plundering of the East Indies began. Africa became a commercial hunting ground for blacks. All of this marked the dawn of the capitalist era of production. For the discovery of the New World, European countries also came, one after another, and excited. They all wanted to, on this undeveloped land, to grab the first slice of cake. In 1607, in North America, established the first permanent colony, Jamestown in Virginia. In the 16th century, some British people, in order to escape religious oppression, began to migrate to the New World. In 1620, a ship named the Mayflower set sail for Virginia and America. However, a storm changed their direction. They stopped more than 500 miles away, over 500 miles away, and stopped. But they didn't have the right to. They did not have the right to stay permanently. In fact, they were out of the king's jurisdiction. To obtain the legitimacy of permanent residence, after discussions on the deck of the Mayflower, they jointly signed a contract and practiced self-government. This contract is also known as the Mayflower Compact. Since then, the story of America began here, and this contract became the birth certificate of America. In the next nearly 100 years, a large number of people from the European continent began to migrate to America. The North American colonies also expanded to 13 before 1760. The British mainland and the North American colonies maintained a good trade relationship, and maritime transportation was also very developed. However, between 1756 and 1763, Britain and France fought an extremely expensive 7 Years' War to make up for the losses in the war. Britain began to tax the colonies, which led to strong dissatisfaction among the people in the colonies. In 1773, the British Parliament, in order to help to overcome its financial crisis, granted it a monopoly on tea sales in North America, which was strongly resisted by the people of North America. The Boston Tea Party broke out. This event aggravated the conflict between Britain and the colonies. Then, in 1774, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Act, which closed the port of Boston and increased the number of troops to seize houses. The British Parliament, a series of high-pressure operations against the colonies, directly restricted the freedom of Boston people and cut off the source of income for the people. This also made the people of 13 colonies in North America began to unite and embarked on a path of violent confrontation with Britain. On September 5, 1774, delegates from all colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress was held. The representatives of the colonies began to plot to discuss armed resistance and independence. This history is not only a turning point in the Americas, but also the beginning of changes in the world pattern, from the peaceful life of the Indians to the suffering of the colonies. From the Mayflower Compact to the Boston Massacre, every step deeply influenced the future of America, and even the whole world. 6 months later, on April 18, 1775, the Lexington militia unexpectedly fired the first shot of resistance. Several small-scale battles broke out one after another. Although these battles were not large-scale, but it meant that the armed confrontation between Britain and America was inevitable. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress was held in Philadelphia. The meeting adopted the world-renowned Declaration of Independence, officially declared the 13 colonies in North America were free from British rule. The meeting decided to build a country by force and formed a regular military force and chose Washington as the commander-in-chief. The American Revolutionary War broke out from 1776 to 1781. The British and Americans fought and negotiated. Finally, with the support of France, the British Army was completely disintegrated on the North American continent. In September 1783, the US and Britain signed the Paris Treaty. Britain officially recognized American independence. The 8-year American Revolutionary War finally achieved victory. In 1787, the Philadelphia Constitution adopted the Constitution of the United States. Since then, the United States was no longer a loose country, but a true republic. Constitution of the United States. The Constitution established the principles of popular sovereignty, the principles of separation of powers, republic, etc. Getting the institutional foundation laid the institutional foundation. Interestingly, at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention on the issue of the federal system, the American political circles had divided into and the anti-federalists. By 1789, the first federal government was established. The Federalists held the power. By 1791, the anti-federalists gradually developed into the Democratic Republican Party, dominated by Democratic forces. After 1824, the Democratic Republican Party split into the Democrats. The latter inherited the political tradition of the Federalists. So the typical two-party political struggle in the US actually appeared at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. In 1789, the first Congress of the United States declared the Constitution effective. It was the first written constitution in the world, and unified country's written constitution. In the same year, Washington, who performed well in the Revolutionary War, was unanimously elected as the first president of the US during his tenure. He established the federal government's cabinet. He issued judicial regulations and established the Supreme Court, which truly established the Federal Republic. Therefore, Washington is also called the Father of America. In March 1797, Washington officially transferred power to Adams, ending his 8-year term as president. At the same time, he also set a precedent, the precedent of 2 terms for the US president. The American Revolutionary War. The United States finally won and declared independence. It can be said to be the founding war of the US. The Second Anglo-American War, in essence, was a battle between the UK for the Canadian colony. Since the American Revolutionary War, Britain had already deployed a large number of troops, ready to fight the US again. And after the American independence, the two sides still had constant friction in maritime trade. In 1812, a war broke out in Europe. The US took advantage of Britain's inattention to America and began to march north. The Second Anglo-American War began, but this war was not as smooth as the US expected. By August 1814, the British even went straight to the nest and occupied Washington. The then US President Madison fled in a hurry. The British Army carried out large-scale destruction in Washington, burning down the White House and the Capitol. America was almost conquered. Just when the United States was in jeopardy, there was a turnaround in the South. Jackson stepped forward and saved the American decline. In December 1814, Jackson led the army in New Orleans. He fought a very beautiful defensive battle and severely damaged the British army. After that, both sides were in a stalemate, and the outcome was uncertain. At the end of December 1814, the two sides signed a truce in Ghent. In this war, neither side gained any advantage, nor did it change the pre-war situation. But it further confirmed the independence of the US. After that, the US could not continue to move northward, and instead began to expand westward. In 1830, President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. the United States began a large-scale westward movement for the native Indians, began to expel and massacre them on a large scale. The westward movement, which allowed the United States to acquire a lot of fertile land and a vast domestic market, which made the U.S. economy develop by leaps and bounds. Indians were originally the owners of this land, but in the process of America's rise, they paid a heavy price. It can be said that the history of the United States is also the tragic history of the Indians. The success of the westward movement accumulated a large amount of capital. By 1846, the United States aimed to further expand its territory, turned its attention to the southern Mexico. In May 1846, the US-Mexico War broke out. This American-initiated aggressive war lasted for nearly 2 years. Finally, in January 1848, the US and Mexico, they sat down at the negotiating table. It was called negotiation. Mexico had no bargaining chips, while the US had an absolute advantage. Finally, Mexico ceded large tracts of land, including California. The US won the war and gained a lot from the southern expansion. In the mid-19th century, the gold rush was triggered by the westward movement. The US-Mexican War gave the US a large amount of land, including California. California was originally a barren land, and San Francisco was just a backward fishing village. However, a worker accidentally discovered a large amount of gold resources. Suddenly, countless gold diggers flooded into this village. San Francisco backstage is referred to as the Old Golden Mountains by Asians. In just over 20 years, the population of California grew rapidly and wealth continued to increase. San Francisco became the most international city in the United States. Therefore, California, as a new member of the United States, the northern industrial state and the southern slave state, were eyeing it. This also directly intensified the conflict between North and South, indirectly led to the outbreak of the Civil War. In fact, after more than 70 years, two distinct economies in the United States, the capitalist economy in the North and the southern slave economy, although both the North and the South had black slaves, but they had different attitudes towards slavery. There were opposite attitudes. The northern industrial states, industrialized through capital expansion, replaced human labor and freed slaves, while the southern states invested was mainly used to buy more slaves, accumulated capital through exploitation and oppression. By 1830, the number of black slaves in the United States had reached millions. Most of them were concentrated in the southern states. Slaves in the South mainly grew sugarcane and cotton, so these cotton were stained with the blood of slaves. The different economic systems in the North and South inevitably led to later economic development and irreconcilable contradictions. As early as 1807, Jefferson signed the Slave Import Act, but it was difficult to implement until 1860. Republican Abraham Lincoln became the 16th president. After taking office, Lincoln, the first thing he did was to lead the United States to abolish slavery, which directly led to the great dissatisfaction of the Southern slave owners, which led to rebellion. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out. The Battle of Sumter kicked off the American Civil War. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln officially issued and implemented the Emancipation Proclamation, allowing American black slaves could obtain legal citizenship and freedom. And this declaration also made many black compatriots join the Northern camp and enhanced the combat effectiveness of the North. The American Civil War lasted for 4 years, and the North finally won the war completely. The issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation was a landmark turning point in the American Civil War. Unfortunately, because extremists were dissatisfied with Lincoln's approach. In April 1865, Lincoln was assassinated at the Washington Opera House. The abolition of slavery also made Lincoln one of the greatest presidents. The end of the American Civil War in 1865, avoiding the risk of the country being divided, but the Republicans and Democrats have been deadlocked. At first, the United States maintained the Republican Party dominated the situation, but with the rise of the Democratic Party, the United States gradually formed a situation where the two major parties were evenly matched. To avoid another civil war, and national reunification and reconstruction. Both parties' intellectuals must cooperate. So in 1877, the Democrats and Republicans reached a compromise. The Democrats recognized the Republican president, and the Republicans temporarily shelved the goal of racial equality. Withdraw federal troops from the South, stop promoting racial equality in the South, and no longer provided support to the Black Power movement, and provide help. The compromise between the two parties, avoiding the crisis of civil war in the United States, and the country was able to achieve reunification and reconstruction. However, the compromise between the two parties betrayed the black community. The achievements of the Civil War were not preserved. The Black Rights Movement has a long way to go. After the compromise between the two parties in 1877, the U.S. once again became unified without internal conflicts. America began to focus on foreign affairs. In 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning Chinese laborers from entering the U.S. Other non-labor Chinese entering the U.S. were also restricted. In 1868, the U.S. signed the Phu-Ancon Treaty with the Qing government. Both sides agreed to respect free immigration. In the 1860s, the United States built the Pacific Railway, which was mostly completed by Chinese workers. But with the depression of the U.S. economy, the public's anti-Chinese sentiment gradually intensified the two-party struggle. To win more votes, Chinese became victims of the party's struggle. On May 9, 1882, President Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. By 1888, which was further expanded on this basis, further excluding Chinese people, the Chinese Exclusion Act, as the first law in American history. First law to restrict immigration of a specific race, one of the harshest foreign policies in American history. It was also legally discriminatory against the Chinese. Until World War II, China and the US became anti-fascist allies. Roosevelt only then did he revoke this discriminatory act against Chinese. At the end of the 19th century, the US overall economic strength suddenly became the world's #1. The rapid expansion of the economy, the US, which originally aimed at expansion, to expand even more crazily in search of new raw material sources, commodity, sales, markets, and investment venues. To extract more high monopoly profits, the US began to expand its colonies, but at this time, the whole world had been divided by the old colonial powers, and the declining Spain became the first target of the United States. In 1894, the US declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War broke out. The primary target was Cuba, which was right next to the US. Cuba was originally a Spanish colony. During the Spanish colonial period, cruelly exploited and oppressed the Cuban people. So the Cuban people launched an uprising against it, and Spain's brutal and bloody suppression provided sufficient reasons and excuses. In April 1898, the US and Spain fought in Southeast Asia, Cuba, and the Caribbean. The war lasted for nearly 4 months. In the end, Spain was defeated by the US. On December 10, 1898, the US and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris. Since then, Spain abandoned Cuba and recognized its independence, ceded Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and paid $20 million, transferring sovereignty of the Philippine Islands to the US. Through this war, the United States officially declared its strength as a great power. The victory of the Spanish-American War also gave the US overseas colonies, with the radical Roosevelt taking office. The United States officially embarked on the path of overseas colonial expansion and opened the door to global hegemony in 1901. Theodore Roosevelt was elected as the 26th president. Theodore Roosevelt, the youngest serving president in American history, his unique personality and reformist policies made him one of the greatest presidents